The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. It's not everyone's favorite Legend of Zelda, but it was my first, so shut up. Just kidding. Anyway, the Legend of Zelda games usually have a lot of dungeons. So, since I clearly have nothing better to do, I decided to make a countdown from the worst to the best dungeon in Twilight Princess. To find out which is the best, I will be looking at each dungeon's item, mini-boss, boss, and overall experience. Remember, this is my personal opinion, I just use logic to get to it, so it's not necessarily better than other opinions out there, I just have proof. Also, if you disagree with my opinion, I would prefer you to rant crazily in the comments section. I don't know why, I always find those comments so hysterical. Coming in at number 8 is the Palace of Twilight. Now, before any of you yell at me out there saying, "No, there's not 8 dungeons in Twilight Princess, there's 9, this guy can't even count, his opinion sucks." 2 dungeons came out in a tie, so it only goes up to 8. That's right, I'll explain that in the next video, but for now, settle down. There's only 8 places, because one is shared by 2 dungeons. Twilight Palace number 8! Yay! To start with this dungeon, I'd just like to emphasize its item. The item that you get in this dungeon isn't really an item, but it's more of an upgrade to your Master Sword, which only really works in the Palace of Twilight. So, yay, pointless item, but it's not the worst one. Moving on is a mini-boss that doesn't really feel as scary as the creepy hand that follows you around, so not very high on the list of mini-bosses. And then a pretty cool boss. The final boss in this dungeon is Usurper King Zant, who's kind of a big deal considering he's one of the main villains that you've been seeing throughout this entire game. So, how does his boss fight really measure up? Pretty well, surprisingly. Usurper King Zant goes through all these different phases, where he kind of copies a bunch of other bosses that you face throughout the game. In doing this, the game makes players use items that they gained throughout the entire game, and I had fun fighting him. After he copies a bunch of bosses, he kind of takes his own road and starts fighting you one-on-one. Except he's a crazy lunatic who's wielding 2 blades and spinning around really fast. Oh, and then he gets dizzy. Kind of an obvious weakness, but not the worst one. The music at this point is also interesting. It's a mix of all the other songs that you hear while fighting him throughout all the stages. So it ends up being this sort of remix of everything, only it feels a lot more insane and out of control. Which kind of fits the situation, so points for you. The overall dungeon experience wasn't exactly admirable. It was very late in the game, and I expected use of a lot of the items that I've had. And I felt that the only place they were really used was the double claw shot in some of the rooms, and then the boss fight with Zant. So, not exactly the greatest for a second to last dungeon. Coming in at number 7 is the Lakebed Temple. Now, I could whine and complain about how this is a water level and how all water levels suck, but I'm not going to. I am instead going to look at the same 4 concepts: the item, the mini-boss, the boss, and the overall dungeon. The item that you get is the Claw Shot, which is a pretty high-ranking item, considering it's pretty much a staple in the Zelda series. But not even the Claw Shot could make up for the rest of this dungeon. The mini-boss is pretty much just a giant frog, which isn't too difficult. I guess it's kind of fun because he's really large. Belly flopped! Frog. Then there's the dungeon boss, which I placed a little higher than I probably should have. Because he is relatively epic looking, but he doesn't really attack you directly because he's so large. Still, he's awesome looking, so I cut him some slack and said, "Hey, you're still great in my book." But he's not that great. And now, the category that really killed the Lakebed Temple, the overall dungeon experience. I was tempted to cut this dungeon some slack, considering a lot of people just hate water dungeons solely for the fact that they have water in it. And I didn't find swimming too painfully difficult. However, I hated this dungeon for one reason. Those dang steps with the waterfalls. How the heck did... Oh my gosh, I hated them. And now for the number 6 dungeon. Or should I say dungeons, considering that this one actually resulted in a tie. The 2 dungeons are the Goron Mines and Hyrule Castle. It was odd that these dungeons scored the same, considering how very different they both are, and how far apart in the game they are. However, after adding everything up, they broke relatively even. Where the Goron Mine has one of the best items ever, the bow and arrow, Hyrule Castle doesn't even have an item, so that makes them extremely different. Both dungeons had pretty equal mini-bosses, with the Goron Mines having Dame Goro, who was relatively simple to beat, considering it's just using the simple mechanic of pushing, and then King Bulblin, who you've seen throughout the game, so kind of ranks a little bit higher, but not that much higher. And then there's the boss fights. While Hyrule Castle has a pretty cool looking boss fight that just felt like it went on forever and ever, which is why it didn't score as good as it should have, the Goron Mines just blatantly had a terrible boss. I mean, it was probably the easiest boss in the entire game. Both dungeons also felt like they just took forever, whether it was because the dungeon was just freakishly large for the reason it was the last dungeon, or whether you had to clomp around for half of the entire dungeon because you had to wear the stupid iron boots that made you walk as slow as anything. In the end, both of these dungeons break pretty equal, so they both get number 6. And coming in at number 5 is the Forest Temple. Yep, that's right, we made it to number 5. Doing good, let's keep going. In this dungeon, the item that you get is the Gale Boomerang. It houses the Fairy of the Winds, which is not important to any plot whatsoever at all. It's a bit like Fee, except less important. The mini-boss in this dungeon was pretty fun. I mean, you didn't really have any items in the game yet, so how do you beat him? By rolling and hitting your head. Wonderful. The main boss, however, didn't score so well. It was extremely easy, which I can understand being the first dungeon, but he had a mini-boss that was good, so why couldn't you have a boss that was good? As for the entire dungeon, it was okay. I mean, you got a bunch of cool-looking spiders, you got all the crazy monkeys, so it was okay, but it wasn't really amazing. Alright, number 4, the technical halfway point, goes to Snow Peak Ruins. By the way, I'm going to start picking up the pace, because I realized I was kind of slow at the beginning. The item that you get in Snow Peak Ruins is the Ball and Chain. Scoring relatively well among the other items, the Ball and Chain is fun. You swing it around, you break things. That is all. This dungeon's mini-boss is also pretty good. It's nice to know that he's actually using the item you're going to get. I think there's only one other mini-boss that does this. In fact, I know there is. Moving on to the boss, it was okay. The entire fight took place on ice, which I know was a part of the challenge, but I just didn't enjoy it. As for the overall dungeon, it was fun. You truly felt like you were exploring an old abandoned house that simply held new people. who just happen to be Yetis, which is normal apparently. And the number 3 dungeon in Twilight Princess is Arbiter's Grounds. That's right, it got a bronze. A lot of people really love this dungeon, so why did it only get in 3rd? Well, to start, its item. It's fun to use, but you rarely ever use it. And sometimes you look awkward when you are using it. And then the mini-boss. Death's Sword, Arbiter's Grounds mini-boss, is very well liked by some people, but I can't stand him for one reason. His weakness is, get this, getting his sword stuck into the floor. That's a more obvious weakness than spinning around and getting dizzy. In fact, it looks like that's why he was trapped in the first place. To save this dungeon, however, there's the boss. Twilight Fossil Stallard. To say that this was a great boss is an understatement. Shattering his spine, hitting his skull, all while on a high-speed chase, it was fun. It just makes me wonder what he was before he turned into a skeleton, though. The rest of the dungeon was really fun. It actually felt like you were going on an adventure somewhere. You might as well have been Indiana Jones, only wearing green. And you're an elf, or something like that. And in our number 2 spot is the City in the Sky. This dungeon felt a little bit different, considering it had a completely different atmosphere. The item that you get is the double claw shot. How cool is that? Sure, it's just another claw shot, but now that you have 2, you can go Spider-Man on the place. Who needs floors? Clearly not this guy. And then there's a mini-boss, who is actually just a common enemy, but this is the first time you encounter him. It's pretty special. He's a little bit unusual and kind of easy, but fun to fight. After all of this, there's the boss, which is basically a dragon. You can defeat him by using your new item, and it's pretty cool just flying and zipping around while he's shooting fire at you out his mouth. You know, because that's what dragons apparently do. As a dungeon overall, it wasn't really great, but in the end, everything else made it pretty good, which is why I got number 2. And here we are at the number 1 dungeon, which is the Temple of Time. Also, congratulations, we made it to number 1 and you didn't exit out of the video. So that's good. Okay, so I know not everyone likes the Temple of Time, but just hear me out. The item that you get in this dungeon, the Dominion Rod, isn't very useful outside of the dungeon itself. However, inside the dungeon, you get to control a very large statue, and the fact that it's wielding a hammer doesn't hurt. But it does hurt everyone else around you, which is it's just great. Still, the item's not that great, so it scored relatively low. However, the mini-boss scored the highest. In the Temple of Time, you get to face a Dark Nut as a mini-boss. Dark Nuts themselves are a sort of staple in the Zelda series, appearing in multiple games. And it's just interesting. Not many enemies that you fight are very competent, but it's nice to be able to have a change of pace and fight a common enemy that happens to be a very well-accomplished swordsman. Moving on to the actual boss, we have Armagoma, a giant spider. This boss battle scored okay. It was pretty good, considering that you get the satisfying feeling of smashing a giant spider with an even bigger fist. Yeah, I like that part. As for the overall dungeon experience, this dungeon scored the highest. Some may complain it was a straightforward dungeon, but I believe that each room held its own unique puzzle, and that's what made it special to me. I mean, who doesn't remember the room with the scale? Or how about the room with all the unique traps, just blades and spinning spiky things, whatever? It was all great. All in all, that leaves the Temple of Time as the number 1 dungeon in The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. Hey, you watched my video. Thanks! Oh, why are you still watching? The video ended. You can click on another link. If you're not in full screen, it's usually over to your left. yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be hopefully making another video that will explain the math behind how I rated everything. Yeah, that's gonna be fun. You can really exit out of the video now. It wasn't a joke. Alright, I'm gonna go. See you next time, I guess? Yeah, alright. See ya.